Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 21st of November 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Ellis. A lot happening, Mike, just incredible.
Happening. Yes, so, well, Theresa is away to Europe, to Brussels today, to meet Jens Stoltenberg. What am I talking about? To meet Jean-Claude Juncker and others. So she'll meet EU officials, apparently, as they try to work out the deal in time for the summit of European leaders on Sunday. Now, of course, this is the future deal. Now, the last time that they met, they're looking very happy there together. The last time that they met, they were shaking hands. They were, well, he was rubbing her back in a very sensitive way. I wonder if that's going to be the case this time, Brian.
Depends how much he's had to drink.
That may well be true. But anyway, the EU was due to release the text of the declaration on the future relationship with the UK on Tuesday, and they've apparently missed that deadline. And so that's what she's going over to try to sort out. This is about the future relationship, not the divorce deal. So there we go. In the meantime, Amber Rudd was on BBC Radio 4 this morning, and this is what she had to say. In my view, it's my view that Parliament, the House of Commons, will stop no deal. There isn't a majority in the House of Commons for that to take place. So she was very much saying that a no deal was not an option, that the Parliament would not support that possibility. And people commenting that, well, Theresa May actually was effectively threatening a no deal should she not get the support that she needs. So Amber Rudd seems to be arguing against Theresa May's position here, so that's perhaps a little bit strange. But anyway, we wait to see this afternoon what happens when she goes to meet Jean-Claude Juncker, if he is able to stand up.
Indeed we do, and we'll say all of the Brexit going on at the moment is a perfect smokescreen for what's happening under the surface, and we come straight back to the subject of EU military unification. Now, David, I'm not sure whether you've seen this tweet yet, but it came out from Veterans for Britain. It said, good news that the Secretary of State for Defence and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee are now in, quote, open revolt against the process of EU military unification, unquote. There is now a big task ahead for them both, fighting May's involvement in its budgets, policies and rule books. Now, this is extremely interesting stuff because it's the first time that we've seen Veterans for Britain, always have to be careful on that one, Veterans for Britain using the EU military unification expression, which of course is the only correct expression. This business of calling it an EU army just distracts people from the seriousness of what's taking place. Were you surprised that Veterans for Britain came out with this?
Well, I'm not so much surprised. I'm encouraged that we're starting to use the correct terminology to attempt to deal with this, because unless we call it by its name, we can't fight it or we can't support it, one or the other. So people can make their own mind up once they know what it is that they're dealing with, you know. And one of the big debunks that we've got to get to grips with, this is not an EU army. That phrase is completely disingenuous. It more or less says that the ownership of this affair and the matter is of the EU's, and it's the EU's army. So anybody here in Britain would automatically, I would think, be disenfranchised when they hear that, because they're going to say, and I've vox popped enough people to confirm this, it's nothing to do with us, we're leaving, because it's the EU army. Now, if you said it was a matter of unifying our army, navy and air force, all the defence services into military union, then their ears are going to prick up. So this is the key thing. So I'm very encouraged that they're using the correct terminology. But what I'm interested in here is that they're saying that there's open revolt between the Secretary of State for Defence and officers. Well, I'd like to see that. I would like to see it. And it's saying open. So where is this open? Show me.
Okay, well, I took a little deeper look into what was actually posted on Veterans for Britain website. This one I found particularly interesting. A lady called Chloe, let's bring her up on screen. Here she is, Chloe Westley. She's campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, a columnist for Conservative Home, and a former Vote Leave staffer. And she says it's crazy and dangerous. So why has the PM failed to withdraw the UK from EU defence arrangements? Britain is locked in. I just find this extraordinary. This lady's come up with this because she's at the centre of things. She's even been writing, as she says, columnist for Conservative Home. I picked her up on the crazy bit because, of course, it's not crazy. This is deliberately crafted and very carefully orchestrated Conservative betrayal led by Theresa May. But fascinating, we're seeing this particular lady now pointing a finger and saying this is dangerous, we're locked in. Conversely, we've got South West MP Johnny Mercer. Now, remember, this young man is an ex-army captain. He's been out there on the front line. He should know what defence is about, but he seems to be having great trouble understanding what goes on around him in Westminster. And here he is saying that the EU has clearly moved beyond what it was originally designed to be. So he's not exactly using robust language and describing the EU military unification for what it is, David. I've never met Johnny Mercer. He's blocked me from his Twitter page because he doesn't like me pointing published articles at him. What do you make of this man? Is he typical of MPs, that they really don't know what's gone on in the background and they're too scared to actually stand up and say when they discover?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, you've got to say where Mr. Mercer's concerned there, really. I mean, what he's doing there openly on his Twitter feed is sort of, he's doing a Manuel, isn't he, from Fawlty Towers? I know nothing. I know nothing, Sybil, you know. He's completely out of the loop. You know, it just beggars belief, isn't it? You know, that all this has been happening in and around him on Defence Committee, and he knows nothing about it.
Yeah. As
if military unification was something brand new. And he's saying, I mean, the thing I've got issue there with is that he's sort of saying that the EU it's a trading bloc and it's straying off course, or, you know, it's not what we were sold, it's not what it intended to be. Whoa, Johnny, it always was about military union and currency union. Now, if you haven't got to grips with that, perhaps it's because you've rejected every single attempt that we've made in order to brief you on this subject. But you clearly don't want to know. Your staff there told us that this would only add a layer to get in the way. There was some words to that effect. So, you know, this guy's late to the party. He's way off target. You know, and he might as well be helping the EU, because he's certainly not opposing it. Not in this fashion. Not that I can see.
OK, well, let's have a look at somebody a bit more senior. This is Colonel Richard Kemp. And he's pretty robust here, because he's basically saying, sorry, let me just bring it up on the other screen. He's saying Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson declares war on EU leaders, calls for EU army to rival NATO. So we can pick him up on the EU army bit there. But the next bit interests me. Meanwhile, our over-powerful civil servants have been quietly enmeshing our forces into EU defence integration. Constant warnings by veterans for Britain ignored. So interesting to see Richard Kemp now starting to focus on what's really happening. And he's also astute enough to start pointing a finger at the civil service, heavily infiltrated by the European Union, of course, and that pernicious charity Common Purpose. But Richard Kemp's starting to see that this is more than just the result of MPs making some decision in Westminster.
That's completely correct. And the first port of call with this, of course, is as far as the Cabinet Office are concerned and the civil service that he's referring back to in this, that have circumvented the MPs, they've circumvented parliamentary statutory instruments like the reserve scrutiny, November 1998, is that, of course, as far as the Cabinet Office and the civil servants are concerned, they're doing their job, because the instructions, as we well know from our film clip there of the 1948 revelation, Clement Attlee's government, is that is what they were tasked to do, was to seek defence treaty with the EU since 1948. So, and that was under the basis of integration. So that's okay. So the engine room is set to integrate. But of course, what they're doing is they're unifying to union. It's a process of unification to go to single point command and control. So unless we undo the engine room's coded language here, and however that's done, I don't mind whether the officers do it or whether it's the MPs or anyone. It doesn't make any odds. But integrate's okay by the Cabinet Office. So if we say that they're integrating, well, they won't take any notice because, well, we're supposed to do that. That's what we're doing. Thumbs up. But of course, this is the con. So Colonel Kemp, if he really wants to put it on the target, must use the correct frames of reference and the correct language. It's no good, as well as he would be aware as a highly professional military man that's in considerable active service and worked within as a cabinet office advisor. Simply no good using the enemy's language. He has to use the correct language in order to put this on the target and frame the target so that we all know what we're dealing with.
Yep. Okay, well, let's quickly have a look at exactly what the EU has been up to in the last couple of days on this. Well, they've been holding the Foreign Affairs Council, so that was on Monday and yesterday, and of course, defence was a big part of this. So they were, defence and foreign ministers were holding discussions on EU cooperation in security and defence. They reviewed the implementation of the EU global strategy in this area, including permanent structured cooperation, that's PESCO, the coordinated annual review on defence, which is CARD, the European Defence Fund, military mobility, the military planning and conduct capability, and the civilian compact, which is CSDP, and the proposal for a European peace facility. That may be an oxymoron there. And they have apparently adopted conclusions on security and defence and so on. So let's have a listen to what Federica Mogherini had to say following this meeting.
Yesterday, a joint session with the defence and the foreign ministers of the 28 member states. And today we had the Council of Defence Ministers, where we also hosted NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg again. I'll come to our cooperation with NATO in a moment. Let me start by saying that yesterday afternoon and this morning, ministers took another major step in our work to build the European Union of Defence. We have agreed yesterday to, first of all, strengthen our civilian crisis management. Ministers adopted a civilian compact that contains over 20 political commitments to reinforce the European Union capacity to deploy civilian expertise. And the decision to strengthen this, first of all, highlights that as we work on the military side, we also work on the civilian side of security. And this would also allow to strengthen civilian military cooperation on the ground. That is one of our, again, unique tools that are extremely appreciated and needed in the current security situation.
So I'll come on to the NATO side of this in a second, David, but one of the key points that you were making during your presentation at the emergency briefing that we held a couple of weeks ago was this issue of civilian and military. Now, she, of course, at this point in time is referring to EU activities in non-EU countries, so outside the European Union. But this doesn't necessarily have to end there, does it?
No, it doesn't. Within the Union of Defence that Federica Mogherini refers to there, and the civilian compacts that they're talking about, and the crisis, this is one of the key words. This is one of the trigger words within a crisis that the EU designates. All sorts of levers can be thrown at their end, and they're off, and they're going to do it. And you're talking about civilian, military, security, and unique tools, I think was one of the phrases that she used there. What this will mean, of course, is that the EU will deploy military civilian capability internally within the EU zone. This is not just an external, it doesn't just have external potential, it has a great deal of internal potential. So you could, for example, see a whole conglomerate of troops being massed into a regiment from here, there and everywhere, all different nations' military, unified into one regiment and then deployed somewhere in the EU zone. That could be Britain. And you could see them deployed here under some sort of crisis arrangement. So this is exactly as Lord Tebbit warned to me would happen at the start of the vote leave period, that they would do this. And he was fully aware. He was no mental reservation or equivocation of any kind did I detect from Lord Tebbit that this would not happen. I completely agreed with him on this issue, that they would have no hesitation in doing this. So obviously these are military troops. They will be armed.
Sorry, David. Let's just look at this for a second, because the other point here is she said that she was going to come on to the issue of the EU's relationship with NATO. So let's just bring NATO into this for 1 second. And the question is, what would they be armed with? And we've mentioned this a number of years ago, but NATO has been deploying non-lethal weapons to NATO personnel under certain circumstances. So here's a tweet from NATO from a couple of years ago saying non-lethal weapons provide options to troops who are faced with uncertainty. And somebody asked in a response to this, but if troops have to be given non-lethal weapons, does that mean they're no longer soldiers, that they are policemen doing law and order? And at the time, if you remember, NATO was promoting this particular less lethal, you note the word less lethal, not non-lethal, less lethal weapon. These were the types of rounds that they were firing, impact only, but also some with an irritating effect, so some kind of chemical in there that was causing irritation. And in fact, NATO admitted that these can cause fatal injury. Now, I mentioned this a few days ago, so let's bring this up again. On the 17th of November 2015, Jens Stoltenberg from NATO and Federica Mogherini from the European Union sat down together at the European Defence Matters Conference. This was the annual European Defence Agency conference. And Federica Mogherini had this to say. She said, "We need to merge military and policing functions." So if we put that together with the EU military unification timeline that we have built on the UK Column website, and we start to see a policy trend here, which doesn't look like it's ending in a very pleasant place. But the thing that concerned me, David, is that already we have now had a report just a week or two ago from mainstream media. This is The Independent. Man wielding sword and making threats, shot by police with rubber bullets. And what The Independent here is saying is that police took down a man wielding a sword and making threats outside a parade of shops in Essex with rubber bullets. The 50-year-old was hit with a baton round as members of the public took cover in nearby shops. CCTV footage showed armed police pulling up and aiming non-lethal baton rounds at the man as he stood with both arms outstretched and the sword in his right hand. Witnesses described the man dropping to the floor and being detained. So that is, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I have not heard of baton rounds being used on the British mainland before. They, of course, were used in Northern Ireland for quite extensively, where during riots and so on in Belfast and other places in Londonderry, the rubber, the so-called plastic bullets, were being replaced with batteries, and they were quite often called battery rounds. So there's a trend here, David, isn't there? And it's a concerning trend, particularly if you start putting together that the police are now using baton rounds on British mainland streets, not even in a riot situation, and the fact that, well, I can't remember where I was going to go with that. So
well, there's no prior dialogue, Mike, is it? It's not as if you have an old-style police officer who's going to attempt to reason with this person from a distance. What you're doing is engaging straight away.
Yes. So, David, David, what are your thoughts on this? Operation Temper, that was where I was going to go with it. We've now already got more talk of military working with police on UK streets. If you put all these policies together, there is a trend.
There's a complete trend, isn't there? You can see a very clear picture there. You know, you're going to have armed in some fashion, quasi-military police. And she's talking about uncertainty within this. Well, it's uncertainty to shoot civilians. That's what we're dealing with here. So within the overall grand concept of the unification of Europe, you're dealing with something that started with this pitch of NATO under the Marshall Plan. And within that concept, right from day one, was absolute unification of military and police and security and everything under single point control. That's the whole point of it. But of course, it couldn't do it all in one go. It's taken a long time. And certainly the electorate in the 50s, 60s and 70s would never have bought into this had they been aware of it or known about it or known the direction of travel. So, you know, Federica Mogherini there is obviously a fellow of the Marshall Plan, and this is probably, you know, where the sort of dots all join up that end. So this is part of the whole concept to go this route, and that people need to understand just how dangerous this unification thing is, because the command and control for all this won't be in Parliament. It won't be your MP. It'll be in the EU to an unelected bureaucrat.
Yeah.
You can't remove.
David, I'll just bring in that we're getting very, very interesting comments in our chat box as we're talking about this subject. People are talking about martial law. They're talking about people being the enemy. And somebody's even said what we're looking at is the emergence of a fascist Fourth Reich is the term being used. And I'm particularly interested in that term because it's appeared in our chat box. But of course, it was Harry Beckhoff, who at the time was the oldest, the longest standing member of the Conservative Party, that wrote a book with that very title, The Fourth Reich, to warn other Conservatives about what the European Union really was. So I think we're starting to see people are following the analysis. They're beginning to join the dots up for themselves. And this is unbelievably serious. Time for Johnny Mercer, in particular Gary Streeter locally, to wake up. And I think the expression is smell the coffee.
Right. Well, of course, the other big lie that David keeps trying to highlight is the fact that this issue of how the EU military unified structures will fit in with NATO. And of course, when Gavin Williamson was criticising the EU's plans for unification a day or two ago, he was doing that from the standpoint of NATO, that NATO provides these protections and so on. So let's just have a listen to what Jens Stoltenberg said as he was arriving at this defence ministers meeting yesterday.
I'm really looking forward to meet the EU defence ministers, and in a few weeks, in the beginning of December, High Representative Federica Mogherini will attend the NATO foreign ministerial meeting, and I think this just reflects the unprecedented level of close cooperation between NATO and the European Union. When I meet the EU defence ministers now, I will also I expect us also to discuss the issue of European defence. I have welcomed EU efforts on defence many times because I believe that projects such as European military mobility, European Defence Fund, PESCO, all of that can contribute to fairer burden sharing within NATO. It can complement NATO, and it can also help to develop new military capabilities and also address the fragmentation of the European defence market.
So he went on to sort of express some minor concerns about duplication of effort and so on, but really the key point here and the key word that he used here, David, both he used it and Federica Mogherini used it during some of her comments yesterday, was unprecedented. This is an unprecedented relationship developing here between Stoltenberg and Mogherini, perhaps the EU and NATO. it is quite unprecedented, and we haven't seen this type of thing before. So anybody that's trying to suggest that EU unification can't happen without damaging NATO is obfuscating the situation here, really.
Well, if they try and play that argument, of course, you know, if you just listen to that clip there that you've got of Jens Stoltenberg, you'll know that what the reality is. The reality is it's seamless, it's overlapping. They're more or less, you know, might as well be the same thing. NATO and EU, as far as defence is concerned, is just a shade of the, you know, a shade of the same colour. And if you listen to that clip carefully, you will hear Mr. Stoltenberg articulate perfectly the granular detail that makes up full EU military union, i.e. that it's everything, it's all in. And
including
he goes
the defence industry.
He goes through it because he cites all of the factors, including the industry, which is what we've said all along. So these people that have sort of, you know, gestured a bit of an interest of this have thought that NATO was a crutch, and it would be oh no, we don't need to worry about defence, you know, we've got NATO, and you know, and that's okay, and nothing to see, move on. Well, of course, what we're now seeing, of course, is that EU military union and NATO are part of the same thing, and they're fully in bed together. And I'm under no doubt about that whatsoever from what he's just said. So particularly when he was saying about developing new capabilities, so that's the future industry and investment, and the structures that they've already established, the structures that have already been agreed by the British government. Now, this is where I took issue with an MP the other day that was saying, it was Andrew Rossendale, that was saying that he'd just been to a conference in Halifax last week, along with one or two others, and saying that, you know, a NATO-sponsored defence conference out there in Canada. You know, it's okay, nothing to worry about, NATO, da-da-da-da. Well, hold on, because what we are dealing with in this country, whether we're in military union or whether we're in NATO, what we're actually talking about is Her Majesty's Armed Services. So what we tend to find is as soon as you focus on what's real to us as a nation, Her Majesty's Armed Services that are in NATO or that support NATO or contribute to NATO. But as we now see, that NATO is now completely in bed with the EU. It's a seamless arrangement. So that's Her Majesty's Armed Services via NATO in military union. Perfect. The perfect storm. Because it's a wall of silence. Nobody seems to be able to evaluate or see this. And yet Mr. Stoltenberg has just said exactly what the score is and what the case is on camera. It's blatantly apparent.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, this article came out on UK Defence Journal a couple of weeks ago. I think it was in September, actually. We missed it at the time, but it was brought to our attention today, so thanks to David Scott for that. No change to Operation Althea, shoulder insignia, contrary to claims on social media. So let's just have a look at what they're saying here. They say, it seemed to me that Veterans for Britain then appeared to suggest that British soldiers were no longer wearing the EU insignia due to supposed outrage it had caused. However, both the Permanent Joint Headquarters and the Ministry of Defence confirmed to me that no change had been enacted with regard to shoulder insignia. So that seems to me what they're saying is that those troops continue to wear that insignia for the duration of that particular operation. And at the end it said, it is unclear whether Veterans for Britain were acting with any motivation or were simply incorrect. What is clear, however, is that social media myths must be challenged. So let's just have a look at the little bit of video that Operation Althea was putting out. This is British troops arriving in Bosnia and Herzegovina for this, wearing the EU insignia on their arms. As you can see there, the video shows the arrival of British troops by Voyager aircraft and the arrival of vehicles and equipment by Antonov. Now, one of the things that article also said was that the opposition to the EU insignia made national news last week. So as I say, this was in September when Andrew Bridges MP addressed the House of Commons. He asked for an urgent statement on UK participation in the EU army, referencing the Brexit campaign in which the prospect of an EU army was dismissed as scaremongering. And so the question is, was this a rumour on social media, or was there something more to it? Well, it turns out that Andrew Bridges, and David, you can tell me exactly when this Bruges Group meeting was, but Andrew Bridges was speaking at the Bruges Group recently, and he had this to say.
I actually raised a point in Business of the House questions about a month ago when I saw some pictures of 3 para arriving for exercise in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and on the insignia on their arm, instead of wearing the Union flag, they've got the EU badge. The Leader of the House did not give a satisfactory answer, but I can assure you that the badges were off within 2 days.
So he's saying the badges were off within 2 days, but the UK Defence Journal is saying that he brought this issue up in Parliament, which he referenced in that little piece of audio there. So this is clearly a bit more than a social media myth. This is, in fact, the source claiming that the badges were off within 2 days, but the UK Defence Journal says that the badges weren't off within 2 days.
So they're mocking an MP, actually.
Well, I'm really asking the question, who's lying here? Because somebody is either the badges were off or they weren't. So the Ministry of Defence says they weren't. Andrew Bridges says they were. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on this, David.
It's a first-rate bit of analysis there, Mike and Brian. So credit to you guys, because yes, you're quite right. What's the truth here? So we've got an MP saying one thing, we've got the MOD saying another. You mentioned a quote there from Joint HQ. So this is multinational Joint Headquarters EU in Royal Navy Command there in Northwood. So that's Commandant General Strickland's domain, isn't it? So, I mean, they're saying scaremongering. That's the comment there from the MOD News Brigade, that this is scaremongering. And, well, yes, it is very scary because you've got British troops serving under EU military operations, something that we were told by MPs, many MPs, that this wasn't going to happen, and it has happened. So we're back to the who's lying game again now. So I think you've uncovered a can of worms here, guys, haven't you? Someone's got some answering to do, very severe answering, because the point here, of course, is that we're all being told that it was a myth and it was scaremongering, but you've got British troops serving under EU military. Yeah. All the while we're being told that that this isn't happening. Well, someone's in denial, or someone's definitely up to no good. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Well, we'll make some follow-up inquiries. It will be our pleasure to do that, see what transpires.
Absolutely. Okay, another brief reminder of AV 9.1 Democracy in Chains, taking place Sunday 2nd of December in the Crown Plaza Hotel in London. Tickets available at alternativeview.co.uk, as well as details of the presentations. So do get along to that if you possibly can.
Excellent. And we'll give a reminder that the trial's continuing for David Notes. Remember, David Notes was one of the former editors of UK Column. And aside from his work to try and help people suffering from cancer, one of David's key statements was that the EU has the constitution of a dictatorship and the laws of a police state, and how right he was. So if you're in the London area and can get along to that trial to see justice being done, and also to give David some support in what is a very difficult time for him, please do. We're still waiting for more details on that case.
Justice in inverted commas there.
Of course.
Yeah.
And also on trial in the same Southwark Crown Court, we've got Sabine McNeill. I'm waiting for an update on her as well. Now, remember, this 74-year-old lady who has to use crutches to walk has endured months in prison on remand. This is all in connection with the Hampstead child abuse case. And I'm happy to say once again that having spoken to the young boy involved in that horrible case and to his mother and her partner, I have no doubt whatsoever that the Hampstead abuse case was real. Sabine McNeill now in prison for trying to speak out and warn the wider British public. We'll also remind people that Melanie Shaw remains in HMP style. We're still waiting for a decision as to whether she's going to get proper psychiatric treatment, proper psychiatric help. But of course she hasn't been allowed to talk to the child abuse inquiry, and we say this is happening in order to protect the Conservative government and the trail of child abuse which leads to Westminster. And before I end on Melanie, I'm just going to put out a warning that we are advising caution with anybody who is seeing a website or Facebook page claiming to be raising money for Melanie Shaw. This is certainly nothing to do with the UK column, and at the moment we are not raising money for Melanie Shaw until the situation clarifies and we can get contact with her. But we understand that there are people at the moment claiming to raise money for Melanie. So be very, very careful where you're donating your money. Will you hear about Melanie Shaw on the BBC? Well, we don't think so. But have a look at this little story. This was sent through to us and very grateful. It was a story that was published on theageofautism.com. Here was the headline: the BBC vaccine critics are a virus. And this related to an interview on BBC Newsnight. Now, I haven't seen the interview and we've only looked at this material fairly quickly, but events unfolded rather fast this morning and we decided we would run with this story. Now, why are we interested in it? Well, we're interested in the fact that a Professor Exley here, has sent a letter through to Newsnight. This is some of what he said, but it was a very long letter. The clear and unambiguous message that Newsnight appears to wish to put across in this piece is that all vaccines are 100% safe and only ill-informed individuals think otherwise. The view that not all vaccines are 100% safe is portrayed as only being held by individuals who are not sufficiently educated to know otherwise. They are somehow slaves to internet scare stories. The message is given that doctors are aware of facts which demonstrate that all vaccines are 100% safe. No facts of any sort are given or discussed. And so the professor goes on with a very hard and damning analysis of really bias within the BBC programme. So let's have a look at the sort of reply that came back. Now, this is from the head of complaints in the BBC. We'll bring him on screen in a minute. And in the published letter, his reply, which is also published on the same website, people can see this. In paragraph 10, it said this: all the leading medical bodies take the view vaccines are an essential public health intervention to prevent serious disease and death. The benefits to human health are considered to outweigh by far any potential risks. I, therefore, do not believe it is inaccurate or misleading to suggest those who try to push the public away from vaccination are responsible for creating a public health scare. And this is part of a letter. Here he is, the gentleman, Colin Tregear, the complaints director. He went on to give a conclusion. In conclusion, I do not believe there are grounds for me to uphold your complaint. I should explain there's no provision for further appeal against this decision within the BBC complaints process, but I will be happy to consider any comments you wish to make about my finding. I'd be grateful if you let me have any such comments by the 26th of November. Now, we were fortunate enough to be able to call Mr. Colin Tregear this morning to ask him whether he really stood by his comments in para 10, that if you dared to criticise the government, the NHS agenda on vaccines, you were actually really a danger. You were helping to destabilise the whole of the government agenda. I did manage to get some dialogue with him, but he was clearly unsettled to have somebody questioning him direct instead of through the wall of security of the BBC. But he stood by his comments and tried the line that he really didn't understand why I should be upset that the BBC said, well, the government's view is the right one. If you disagree with it, be you a doctor or somebody on social media, then really you're a danger. That's what it came down to. But we did a bit more research, and we discovered that this was also Colin Tregar's approach when it came down to transgender. This is from abouttrans.org.uk article from the 2nd of August 2013. And here's Colin having coffee and cakes with a small delegation of trans individuals who'd gone to the BBC to complain about the way that the BBC was handling their particular subject. Well, what a remarkable difference, because here's some of his comments. It sounds obvious, but just talking to someone about an issue and hearing their passion had a real impact for me. It's always interesting to hear people's stories. I came away with a sense that although it seems like a very slow process to shift opinions and prejudices, even unwitting prejudices, progress can be made and there is more we can do. The fact is, I spoke to a number of colleagues in the following days about the things we talked about and discussed some of the ways in which the BBC can be more responsive to and more aware of the issues which matter to trans people and the manner in which they are portrayed. What a remarkable contrast to the way that he deals with people who have concerns about vaccines. And just before I bring you back in, Mike, just for some comments here, this is a bit more of that trans article. So influencing a change in culture and interaction is just the starting point. But Colin said a bit more down here. Let's have a look. There we are. He highlighted the importance of it not just being a once-off meeting and told us he would be interested to hear more comments on an ongoing basis on the BBC's commercial programming, even if it was just an email with some thoughts about the positive and negative aspects of a programme. So this is a very reasonable man here, but he didn't seem to have the same air of reasonableness over vaccine concerns. He said to us that he didn't think it was fair to compare his response to Professor Exley regarding vaccine concerns with his interview and comments with All About Trans volunteers. But we ask, will he be as interested to hear more on vaccines as he is trans matters? Well, Mike, you overheard most of the conversation. Was I unfair to this man? I don't think I was.
No, I don't think you were. But what's at the heart of this is the BBC's attitude to certain issues. So clearly, in this case, the transgender issue is something that the BBC wants to support. Concerns about vaccines is something that the BBC does not want to support. And another area that the BBC absolutely wants to support is the promotion of climate change and everything that goes around that. So the BBC has made a statement recently that although they're required to provide balance in the reporting, that when there is scientific consensus, which is really unambiguous and you can't argue against it, that there's no need to have a climate change denier on to provide the other side of the story. That seems to be the case, the attitude they're taking with vaccines as well. You don't need to have somebody who's raising concerns about the use of vaccines on the programme, because the scientific consensus is that vaccines are safe and we have to use them. Now, of course, the idea of consensus with science, as far as I'm concerned, is these are two separate issues. You cannot have, the whole point of science is that you're investigating the truth. It's not about evidence. Yes, and evidence, and there are different opinions within the scientific community, and these opinions should get a voice. And so it seems that in this case, what we have is pretty clear evidence that where the BBC likes a policy or likes a particular campaign, they're quite happy to look on it favourably and promote it in a favourable way. But a campaign that they don't like very much, they'll simply shut down. Yeah,
and of course, exactly the same angle was taken over Syria, where clearly the BBC, supported by its own charity, BBC Media Action, was for regime change, and therefore that is the way the BBC reporting went. But I've got to say, Colin did take the trouble to speak to me, although he was very edgy, and he was rather keen to get me to go back through media, because I'd been naughty enough to get his mobile phone number But there we are. It's tough working inside the BBC. David, a few comments from you before we close.
Yeah, well, the BBC is really just a tool of the inner sanctum there in the government. You know, it's a tool of the Cabinet Office, and everybody just needs to see it for what it is. You know, we're taxed for the privilege, of course. You know, and we need to really, you know, I mean, what can we do? Switch off. Don't watch the stuff. You know, just by all means, you know, challenge them as you guys are doing there. But you know, this is down to the general public to walk away from them. You know, if we all walk away from the BBC, you know, they'll have nobody to talk to, will they? And then that's it. Problem solved.
That's it. But we say to our audience, do go to the All About Trans website and have a look at that article, read it yourself, read both the letters and make your own minds up, which is the most important thing. David, thank you very much for joining us. And we'll say thank you very much to all the people supporting the UK column and all the people who have donated recently. It's been really nice. If you're still a free subscription person, please consider making a full subscription, because we would like to expand what we're doing in the new year. We can only do that with your financial help. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.